Carl Jung mapped the unconscious. He named the shadow, the anima, the collective unconscious, the archetypes that structure human experience across every culture that has ever existed. He spent 4 decades looking at the deepest mechanisms of the human mind with more precision and more courage than almost any thinker before or after him. And in all of that looking, in all of those years of sitting across from patients and reading their dreams, and tracing the patterns that run beneath everything we think we consciously are, there was one capacity he returned to again and again without ever being able to fully account for it. A capacity he documented. A capacity he respected and was unsettled by in equal measure. A capacity that appears with striking consistency in a very specific kind of woman. The kind of woman this channel is built around. Today we are going to talk about what that capacity actually is, what Jung actually said about it, and why a man who had looked into the deepest parts of the human psyche found himself, quietly on the record, afraid of it. Before we can talk about the capacity, we need to understand what Jung believed about the architecture of the self. He argued, and spent his career demonstrating, that the part of us we call consciousness, the part that speaks and plans and navigates the ordinary business of the day, is a very thin layer over something vastly larger. Beneath it sits the personal unconscious. Everything we have experienced, repressed, forgotten, or not yet processed. And beneath that, deeper still, sits something that does not belong to any individual at all. The collective unconscious. A layer of the psyche that is shared across all human beings, composed of the archetypes, the inherited patterns, the primordial images that structure human experience at its deepest level. Jung believed that most people live almost entirely on the surface, that they interact with the thin layer of consciousness, while the enormous depth beneath it operates unexamined, unacknowledged, driving behavior and shaping experience in ways the surface self never fully understands. He also believed, and this is where it gets interesting, that there existed certain individuals, rare and almost always deeply uncomfortable to be around, who were capable of moving between the layers, who lived not just on the surface but in active, conscious relationship with what lay beneath. Who could descend into the depths and return, not destroyed by what they found there, but changed by it in ways that were visible to everyone around them and explicable to almost no one. Individuation was Jung's word for the process by which a person becomes fully and authentically themselves. Not the self that is constructed to please others, not the persona, the mask worn for social consumption, but the genuine, integrated, complete self that includes the acknowledged light and the confronted shadow. Jung believed individuation was the highest achievement available to a human being. He also believed it was extraordinarily rare, not because people lacked the capacity for it in theory, but because the process required something that the vast majority of people were unwilling or unable to do. It required a sustained encounter with the shadow, with the parts of the self that are uncomfortable, that contradict the pleasant self-image, that have been buried precisely because looking at them directly is painful. It required the willingness to be, for a period of time, in a state of complete psychological disorientation, to release old identities before new ones had formed, to navigate the in-between without the comfort of knowing what was on the other side. And it required a quality of ruthless honesty about the self that most people, given the choice, will spend their entire lives avoiding. The Sigma female, Jung would have noted, does not avoid this. She moves through it, again and again, as though the thing most people spend their lives running from is simply the terrain she moves through on the way to wherever she is going. The first of the capacities that Jung documented, the one he found most difficult to account for through ordinary psychological mechanisms, was a form of perception that goes by several names in his writing. He called it in different places intuition, gnosis, and in his more honest moments, something for which he said he had no adequate scientific term. It is the capacity to know something about a person, a situation, or an event with a directness and an accuracy that bypasses the ordinary channels of information gathering. Not guessing, not inference from visible evidence, not experience applied to a new situation. Something more immediate than any of those things. an arriving of knowledge that feels less like deduction and more like recognition. Like the information was always there, and the perceiver simply walked close enough to it to finally hear it clearly. Jung encountered this capacity repeatedly in his clinical work. He documented cases where patients knew things they had no ordinary means of knowing. He documented his own experiences of it, moments of sudden, complete, and ultimately accurate understanding that arrived without a traceable process. And he noticed, with a consistency he found difficult to dismiss, that this capacity appeared most strongly and most reliably in a specific type of woman: introspective, self-contained, highly developed in her inner life, unwilling to perform herself for others, deeply connected to her own unconscious processes in a way that gave her access to information that was invisible to people who had not made that connection. He was fascinated by this. He was also, he admitted in his letters, somewhat afraid of it, because it suggested a form of knowing that existed outside the boundaries of what he had built his career on explaining. Oh, what we would recognize as the Sigma female could sit with another person and perceive not just what that person was presenting, but what they were not saying, what they were defending against, what they had buried and not yet named, and were hoping no one would ask about. Not as an act of intrusion, simply as a function of their presence. As though their attunement to the unconscious layer of experience was so developed that it allowed them to read the unconscious material of others almost involuntarily. Jung found this capacity extraordinary for a specific reason. It meant that the people who possessed it were living with a degree of information about human experience that was simply not available to most people. And living with that degree of information, he noted, was not comfortable. It was isolating. It was heavy. It was the specific loneliness of someone who sees too clearly to be able to fully participate in the comfortable illusions that most social interaction depends upon. Jung was careful in his writing about this kind of perception to document not just the capacity but the weight of it. Because one of the things he observed, one of the things that clearly moved him, that he returned to in his writing with a quality of something approaching compassion, was that the individuals who possessed this depth of perception did not find it easy. They found it necessary. They found it inevitable. They found it, in many ways, the most real and most honest dimension of their experience. But easy was not the word any of them used. The weight of perceiving clearly in a world that operates primarily through comfortable fiction. The isolation of living at a level of depth that most people around you do not access. The specific exhaustion of being unable to turn off a kind of perception that arrives constantly without invitation, whether you are ready for it or not. All of this was present in the people Jung was describing. And he named it. He said in one of his most direct statements on the subject that the individual who is genuinely individuated, who has developed the full range of these capacities, pays for that development in the currency of ordinary belonging, that the depth that makes them extraordinary is the same depth that makes them, in the ordinary social world, essentially alone. I want to be precise about this. When I say that Jung was afraid of this capacity, the intuitive knowing, the depth perception, the fully individuated self that the Sigma female type embodies, I do not mean afraid in a simple or dismissive way. I do not mean he thought it was dangerous in any harmful sense. What I mean is something more specific and more interesting than that. Jung was afraid of it because it challenged something he needed to be true. Jung had built his entire life's work on the idea that the unconscious could be mapped, that the depths could be charted, that archetypes could be named, that the irrational forces beneath consciousness could be brought into relationship with consciousness through the right process, over time, with enough courage and enough honesty. And then he kept encountering women of exactly the Sigma female type, whose relationship to the unconscious did not work the way his map said it should, who moved through depth without requiring the scaffolding his system provided, who knew things without going through the process of arriving at knowing them, who were individuated in ways he could observe and document, but could not fully account for through his theoretical framework. And that gap, the gap between what his framework predicted and what he was actually observing in these women, is where the fear lived. Not fear of harm, fear of the limit of his own understanding, fear that the territory was larger than the map, fear that there existed a form of psychological depth and a quality of human capacity that was real, observable, and genuinely extraordinary, and that it was not fully his to explain. In his later writing, in the work he produced after decades of observation, after the confrontation with his own unconscious, that he documented in the Red Book, after he had stopped trying to be purely scientific about things that resisted pure science, Jung began to use different language for the capacity we are describing. He moved away from clinical terms and towards something more ancient. He called it in different places Sophia, the Greek word for wisdom, but not wisdom in the ordinary sense of accumulated knowledge or well-applied experience. Sophia, in the tradition Jung was drawing from, is something closer to a direct perception of truth, an immediate knowing of the real, a capacity to apprehend what is actually there beneath what is presented, in people, in situations, in the self, with a directness that bypasses the usual mechanisms of understanding. And Jung, who spent his life trying to bring the irrational into relationship with the rational, who built a career on the idea that the unconscious could be made conscious through sustained work and courage and honesty, Jung ultimately concluded, in the quietest and most honest parts of his writing, that Sophia was not something that could be fully taught, fully systematized, or fully explained. It was, he said, something that certain people, the deeply individuated, the genuinely self-confronted, the type of woman who has looked into her own depths without flinching and continued to look, were simply structurally capable of. Not as an achievement they had earned, as a nature they had been given or had built so early and so thoroughly that the origin no longer mattered. And what terrified him, what he came back to in his final years with a quality of genuine awe, was that Sophia, when it appeared in a fully developed human being, was not a quality among other qualities. It was the organizing principle, the thing that everything else arranged itself around. The woman who possessed it fully was not someone who had Sophia the way you might have a talent or a skill. She was Sophia. She had become, through the whole long process of facing herself without retreat, an embodiment of the thing he had spent his life trying to understand from the outside. Aided it, who carries the capacity for Sophia, who moves through the world with the depth and the perception and the particular quality of presence that cannot be faked or performed or learned from the outside. That woman is not a product of her circumstances. She is a product of her courage. Her specific, sustained, quietly devastating courage to be exactly what she is, in a world that would have preferred something easier to manage. And the fact that this courage is rarely recognized for what it is, that it is more often experienced by the people around her as something unsettling, something that demands too much, something that makes ordinary people feel seen in ways they did not ask for. That, Jung concluded, was not her problem. That was the world's problem. She had already solved hers. If something in this video has named something in you that you have carried for a long time without a name, that is not a coincidence. You are exactly who this channel is built for. Stay with us.